0345 6060973.
The time is 9:19 and I'm changing the subject. The Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem has left the building. I want to change up the subject because another very important issue has arisen. You may have heard the ineffably dignified mother of the murdered teenager, Brianna Ghey, who spoke today. She said amongst other things that she thought there should be a ban on social media apps for all under 16s. I mean, really, we could spend hours, days, weeks establishing with our parent cohort how hard this would be. But I think this is a good moment to ask all of us, our families, our friends, ourselves, honestly, and interrogate this, which is how has social media, the endemic addiction, and I put my hand up, addiction to smartphones affected our children and our mental health. Do you agree with Esther Ghey that children under 16 should be banned from social media? I mean, I don't need to tell you, because we've all seen the news, that children have been murdered or taken their lives after consuming content on Instagram or Snapchat or the dark web, being bullied on these apps and these sites. So my question, as we go into an interview with Miriam Cates, the Conservative MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, is how have you been affected by social media apps, smartphone addiction? Has it changed your life in the way that it so tragically changed the life of the Ghey family? 0345 6060973. You can text 84850. You can tweet at LBC. Miriam Cates, MP, joins us now. As I said, you're the Tory MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge. You've written passionately about this subject. I've got your piece in front of me, Miriam. The scandal of our screens. What is the scandal in your view? Thank you for coming on.
Oh, good evening. No, it's nice to be with you. I think the scandal is just the scale of the problem and how it is consuming our children. And don't forget, this is a very new problem. I mean, just 15 years ago, children didn't have smartphones. None of us really knew what social media was. We might have joined Facebook and shared a few pictures of cats, but we had no idea how this was going to take over our lives and, sadly, the lives of our children. And I think from some of the tragic cases that you've just mentioned, Brianna Ghey, but also Molly Russell, there was an inquest into a death of another girl, Mia Janin, last week, who took her own life. But it's not just the extreme cases, it's also the everyday. And if you look at any measure of teen mental health and well-being, whether that's visits to hospital because of self-harm, whether that's feelings of inadequacy and feeling purposeless or loneliness, all of our teenage mental health, all of those measures have just collapsed since 2010. So
2010 being the common, just to remind everyone, 2010 is the established date for when the smartphone became kind of commonly used, whereby you could access, obviously, the internet and apps online on a device that was as powerful as a home computer that is in the palm of your hand, that has been called, Miriam, a lethal weapon.
Yes, and clearly it has been for many children. And if you look at some of the self-harm content that is served up to children, for example, on Instagram, you know how Instagram works. Once you look at something, once you show an interest in something, Instagram deliberately feeds you more and more of that content. That is their business model. Now, obviously, if you're looking at recipes or something like that, it can be very useful. But if you're being drawn into really dangerous content or violent content, clearly this warps teenagers' minds to the point where they can do awful things. But it isn't just the extreme content, whether that's violence or pornography, which has become an enormous problem, especially for teenage boys. It's also just the addictive nature of it. And I think I saw some research. The average teen receives 237 notifications a day. That's a dopamine hit every 4 minutes. I mean, that is an addiction by any measure. And so, of course, while I understand that calling for, let's say, a social media ban for under 16s might seem extreme, it might seem a big move, I just don't see what else we can do to save our children from what has become, a real danger to their safeguarding.
You've pointed out in your own article that this ban has already taken place in Florida. Is there any evidence to show that it's working, that it can be enforced in the southern state of the United States?
Well, that law's only just been passed. So the answer is don't know yet. Don't know how that will be effective. I think the way that this should work is the responsibility has to be on the social media companies not to allow anybody under 16 to join their platform.
Sorry, I know that gambling sites have a age verification. Can a similar age verification be done with children when, okay, but they don't necessarily have a credit card? How would they do it, Miriam?
The tech companies absolutely have the technology in order to be able to do this. So, for example, YouTube decided to be responsible and kicked off, I think, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of under 13 accounts off their site. So they know they can use AI to work out the kind of words you use, the kind of topics you're interested in, to know your age very precisely. They do know the age of these children. And the whistleblower who used to be a Meta executive, Arturo Bejar, he was in Parliament a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about how Instagram, Meta absolutely do know how many children under 13 are on their sites, how many 13 to 15-year-olds on their sites. They do have the power to do this. And I think what we're starting to realize is that these big tech companies are a vested interest, the size of which the world has never really known before. You know, some of these companies have bigger GDP than almost all countries in the world, bigger worth, than the GDP of almost all countries in the world. They are huge. They can do this, but they're not going to. Only governments and passing new laws can actually stand up to these vested interests. And that's why there has to be a role for government, for legislation. And I'm completely sympathetic to people say this is the parents' job. You know, I am the last person in the world to advocate for nanny state. But parents cannot stand up to the might of big tech without some help from regulation and some help from government. And I think we've reached the point where we've got to go down that route.
And so are you really saying that these tech giants regard the deaths of children who've been sucked into the dark web or have watched things that have completely warped their brains, have committed suicide, who've committed murders, the deaths of those children are the cost of doing business?
Well, using our children's data and drawing them into addictive social media sites is absolutely part of their business model. They are aware of the harms. That's become clear in the congressional hearings this week when some of the emails were read out between Mark Zuckerberg and some of his executives. They do know the harms. But sadly, they have shown themselves over the last 5 or 10 years that they're not willing to act. We passed the Online Safety Act last year in this country. That was quite a big piece of legislation. It's not fully enacted yet. In theory, when it is fully enacted, it will put huge fines and potentially even prison sentences on, say, social media bosses who fail to protect children. But of course, they have a lot of lawyers. They have a lot of money. This isn't going to be straightforward. But we have, that is a step forward. That will be a step forward. But I think even if we did get all the horrendous content off social media or not for under 16s, we still have this problem of addiction. And, I mentioned it just before. I think one of the biggest problems on the internet at the moment for children is pornography. The Children's Commissioner did a study last year that showed the average age that a child accessed hardcore pornography for the first time was 13. This is changing the way that children think about sex and relationships. And we've just seen now that 50% of child sexual abuse is actually committed by other children. So this is another factor of having the internet in your pocket that sadly can't just be outlawed by a few restrictions here and there. It has become an addiction again. And so I think, we have to look at this cross-party and in a non-party political way. How do we rescue our children from this?
But as you say, the Online Safety Act has been passed. Esther Jai and you, Miriam Kate, seem to be in agreement that you've got to go down the road that Florida has and become more nanny state in order to, for so many reasons, the plasticity of children's brains, sexuality, how it's warping, how they develop, how they have sexual relationships, how they think about women, or especially, as you say, young boys. How then do you action this desire to ban children under 16 from using smartphones and using social media apps on their smartphones? What are the next steps?
Well, I think this does need debate and it needs input from experts. Absolutely. I'm not a tech expert. I'm not a legal expert, but certainly the model of not allowing under 16s to have to have social media accounts would be a first step. We've just talked about how technology could actually assist in that. But I do think we will have to look at whether we only allow under 16s to have dumb phones, if you like, the Nokia 3310, where you can text and you can call and you can play Snake, but you can't do all those other things that have become so destructive. Now, that sounds ambitious. And at the moment, lots of people are saying, no, we can never do that. But at previous points in our history, when children have been really endangered by new technologies or changes in circumstances, whether that's children going down the mines in the Industrial Revolution, children being drawn into prostitution in Victorian times, of course, lots of people said, that can't be done. It can't be done. The vested interests are too big. It's too difficult. But I just think we've reached another moment like that, actually, where our children are under threat. Children of all ages, all social classes, wherever they live in the country, their safety and well-being and their future is under threat by social media. We can't deny that anymore. And therefore, it's just not good enough to say we can't do anything about it. We've got to do something about it. Yes, that will take discussion. We need to be clever about what we do, but not doing anything is no longer an option.
It seems to me that you do have some opposition from within your own party. I think Kemi Badenoch said that the online safety bill was legislating for sort of hurt feelings. But Peter Kyle has today spoken in support of your idea and Esther Jai's idea that under 16 should be banned from using smartphones. So do you think this is something, if ever, will come in under a Labour government, not a Tory one?
Well, there certainly were aspects of the Online Safety Act that did threaten free speech in its first iteration, but the government did take those out. So that's perhaps what Kemi was referring to. But I think this idea of the nanny state, we need to take this head on. I am opposed to anywhere where the state tries to take the job of parents. So brushing kids' teeth, that's ridiculous. The state does not need to brush kids' teeth, okay? The state is a bad parent. Parents are supposed to be parents. But we don't parent in isolation. Imagine that there was no regulation of the roads at all, that there were no speed limits, that there were no traffic lights, that there was no side of the road you had to drive on, and that you wouldn't be prosecuted if you hit a child. No parent, however diligent, however good, however clever, could teach their child to cross the road safely in those circumstances. We need government to regulate, to partner with us in order to keep our children safe.
So are you saying...
is that unregulated space?
You're saying basically that a child with a smartphone is at risk and a parent cannot make that world safe for their child. However good a parent they are, the state has to step in.
The state has to regulate, because the parents cannot stand up to the vested interests of big tech, just like we couldn't stand up to unregulated roads. I don't think that's nanny state. I think that's good state.
Thank you so much for your time, Miriam Cates, Conservative MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge. She has echoed Esther Jai's calls for a smartphone and social media ban for under 18s. Do you agree? I think I'm convinced. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to